everyone, this is Professor Gravett, and in this video I'm going to talk about the second part of Nervous Conditions by T.C. Dangarembga. So I'm going to share my screen and talk you through a PowerPoint. All right, hopefully you can see that. Yes, good. Okay, so Nervous Conditions Part 2. So in this video, we're actually going to talk about quite a bit. Last week's video was a little short, so we're covering a lot of ground here. So we're going to talk about a number of themes in the novel, and then I'm going to go over some of the terms that I had you read about in the supplementary material, post-colonialism and African feminisms, and then finally I'm going to talk you through your discussion post. So that's our agenda. All right, so there are a number of themes in this novel that I want to discuss, and a lot of them sort of break down along binary lines, which is part of what I'm going to have you think about for your discussion post. So we're going to talk a little bit about gender, a little bit about race, the distinctions that are made between Englishness and Africanness, or Europe and Africa, and urban versus rural, right? So there are a lot of binaries here, a lot of stereotypes that are constructed, but then also broken down. So we can talk through each of these separately. Okay, so gender roles. As you can see throughout this novel, gender is of huge concern. The characters all have different relations to the gender roles that they've been assigned, and sort of react to that differently. So Nyasha, one of the main characters in the novel, and Tambu's cousin, sort of her closest friend, is not submissive, right? As I've listed here, women, the sort of construction of women is that they are housebound, they're submissive to their husbands, they are, to deal with the food, but, they don't sort of make their own decisions, right? But Nyasha, it goes against this, yeah? And her father, Bamakuru, seems benevolent, but then when women disobey him, he turns quite violent. And there's a really pivotal scene in the middle of the novel where the two come to blows, and he thinks it's against the proper order of things for women, especially his daughter, to want to think and do for themselves, right? And we'll sort of talk more about that in the context of feminism as well. Tambu, on the other hand, does do as she's told. She follows the rules, but at the same time, she seeks education for herself and not just for the betterment of her family. She does break out of some of these rules and is starting to see them for what they are by the end of the novel. My guru, who is Bamakuru's wife, received an education, but can't really do anything with it, right? So she has a master's degree, which is sort of unheard of for women from where Tambu is from. But again, she can't do anything with it. So, whereas men are sort of the providers and rulers here, women, as I've mentioned, are housebound, submissive to their husbands, right? So similar gender roles as we see, throughout some of the novels that we've been reading, and also probably ones that you've seen played out in your own lives, to varying degrees, right? So there's also a lot of tension between race and religion here. So these are a couple of quotes from the novel. This is when Tambu is first going to the mission, first going to Bamakuru's house in the school. So she writes, "Another thing that was different about the mission was that there were many white people there. The whites on the mission were a special kind of white person, special in the way that my grandmother had explained to me, for they were holy. They had come not to take, but to give. They were about God's business here in darkest Africa. They had given up the comforts and security of their own homes to come and lighten our darkness." So I think you can kind of see there's a little bit of tongue-in-cheekness here. Or at least, we see this from the perspective of Tambu, who is a child, right? But then she reflects back towards the end of the page. She says, "At the time, though, and you must remember that I was very young then, very young and correct in my desire to admire and defer to all the superior people I found at the mission. At that time, I liked the missionaries." Sorry, that's a typo. Yeah, so we can see through the sort of development here that the perspective that she talks about in the first passage here, where, missionaries are superior, they're there to like bring God's lightness into the darkness of Africa. We kind of see this in a tongue-in-cheek way when we see that she's reflecting on this and thinking about how young she was and how much she didn't know, right? So, white people are constructed here as educated, beautiful, like coming to bring, the enlightenment of God to deep dark Africa, and Black people are sort of in need of this enlightenment by the British, right? And these are things that are being set up so that we question them, right? So that the reader thinks twice about it. Yeah, when you read a passage like this, I think we're supposed to understand that Tambu's learning about, how these binaries are set up, how whiteness is constructed and how Blackness is constructed as in need of religion, as in need of education, all this stuff, right? So I think we're supposed to be a bit critical of these these portrayals. And to sort of go along with that, Englishness and Africanness are sort of pitted against one another. While the English have less rigid gender roles as sort of exhibited by Nyasha, there might be more access for education for women, and yet the racial boundaries are still quite firm. As we were talking about in the previous slide, Africans are sort of portrayed as in need of this enlightenment and rigidity, whereas, white people are sort of this quote unquote white saviors, right? That's sort of a common term. So this is a quote from the novel about Nyasha, who has taken on a lot of British mannerisms because she lived there in the first, in some formative years of her life when she was a child. So it says, as it turned out, it was not Nyasha's accent they disliked, and the they is sort of her school peers, her friends at school. But Nyasha herself, she thinks she is white, they used to sneer, and that was as bad as a curse. She is proud, pronounced others. She is loose, the most vicious condemned her. So this again is sort of constructing, the African woman is very submissive, very quiet and reserved, and an English woman as sort of being loose and loud and proud of herself, right? But we see in Nyasha somebody who breaks those boundaries, somebody who is deconstructing that binary, right? Okay, so the last sort of binary I want to talk about is these distinctions between rural and urban. And these kind of, again, all of these sort of fall along similar lines. And I think we're meant to question how all of these things are constructed and the real sort of pros and cons of each, right? So this is from when Tambu is returning to her homestead, because if we remember at the beginning, she sees her home as her home, right? She doesn't like the way that outsiders treat it. She feels quite defensive about it. But then she says, this is on page 125, she says, as we drove on to the homestead, I repeated the comparisons I had made on that first day that I went to the mission, but this time in reverse. What I saw made it hard to understand Bamukuru. As far as I could see, the only affection anyone could have for that compound had to come out of loyalty. So she now sort of sees it as, she sees the latrine and she sees how dirty it is. She sort of she's able to see the poverty because she has something to compare it to. And again, these binaries are set up as, the rural is sort of dirty, uneducated, in squalor and poverty. And the urban mission, the sort of city, is constructed as clean, as educated, as wealthy, right? That these two things don't often come together. But again, Tambu is from there. We're meant to question this. We're meant to try to deconstruct some of how these binaries are being constructed. Okay, so the last two things I want to talk about in this video are post-colonialism and African feminisms and how they relate to some of the binaries that we just discussed. So most of this is from the encyclopedia entry that I had you read for this week. So it says, in temporal terms, post-colonial does not refer simply to the period after colonialism, but assumes continuity. In terms of the continued effects of processes initiated during colonialism, as well as discontinuity in terms of new processes unfolding subsequently. So what I'm taking this to mean is that, post-colonial theory or post-colonial criticism, which is a way to look at literature. It's also a way to look at society, history, all kinds of things, right? Is looking not just, the period right after a nation becomes independent, but the things that are the same and the things that are different, right? So if we sort of look back at the religion slide, we're talking about the mission, yes. So in this quote, Tambu is referring to her grandmother who told her stories of the initial colonialism by the British, which, drove people off their land. Yes. Now, a continuity is that the missionaries are there to quote unquote help, right? They had not come to take, but to give. So there's both a continuation and a difference there. Similar but different in that there's still a majority of white people in charge, the majority of whom are in charge of sort of indigenous education, but the title is different, right? They say that the purpose is different there. So the term here is defined as, quote, the study of the attempted transformation, successful and otherwise, of former colonies in the context of changing imperial conditions. So this is one of those conditions. And states can go in a variety of directions, post-independence, some towards social change and some towards social control, as the article states. And the systems already in place can dictate these directions. So, for example, this is also from the text, the literature has characterized the activities of international financial institutions as, quote, rolling back the state and bypassing the autonomy of the state in several critical ways through policy prescriptions and financing patterns. So what this means is that, this is sort of harkening back to neo-imperialism that we talked about in A Small Place, and how international financial institutions that have assets in these post-colonial countries end up dictating the directions in which these states go, right? And again, we can see this in nervous conditions through the work of the missionaries, through the work of the mission, through the education of indigenous Black people into whiteness, right? Into sort of the structures of specifically English whiteness. Okay, so last concept here that I'm going to talk about is African feminisms, and we can see a lot of this being espoused in the novel in various ways. So what is African feminisms? So again, these are from the encyclopedia entries. At issue is the appropriateness and adequacy of the feminist label for African women's struggles. Some reject the imposition of a foreign label on an African phenomenon. Others reject the ascription of the feminist label on African women's insurgencies because they're not driven by gender-specific issues. So while what we look at from the book may sort of look feminist to us, that term might not necessarily be the right one, but it's kind of close, right? It's sort of there's a corollary there. So it continues to say the disagreement between these two schools of thought, on the one hand, those insisting that feminism is foreign to the African environment, and on the other hand, those affirming that feminism is indigenous to Africa, is primarily due to perceptions of Western feminism, particularly its packaging and what it has come to represent. So we don't always have to assume that Western or white feminism is like the only version and everything else diverges from that, right? So they say feminist ideals of equity and resistance to all forms of domination are indigenous to Africa and have propelled women's social action for centuries. Yeah. So this is, I think, important because a lot of the binaries that are set up in the novel sort of show Englishness as more progressive in terms of gender politics, but at the same time are implementing that oppression in other forms, like through the patriarchy that Baba Makuru espouses. And to say that feminism is sort of imposed on Africa is anachronistic in many ways, right? That feminism in one form or the other, whether it was called that or not, has existed in Africa for centuries, right? But it just looks a little bit different, right? So to sort of continue on this vein, the way that it looks different, the rationale, strategies, modalities, and context governing women's social action in Africa are as heterogeneous and complex as the continent itself. Remember, Africa is a continent, and cannot be adequately captured by a monolithic idea such as feminism. Hence the use of the plural feminisms in the title of this entry, right? It looks quite different in different social contexts in different countries, in different struggles. So the last quote here, just as the women of color movement compelled a Western feminist thinking and theorizing to liberate itself from the myopia of gender specificity, to broaden and intensify its context and texture by allowing other categories such as race and class to intersect with gender, African feminisms made further demands on feminism to expand its analytical horizon by incorporating other considerations such as culture, colonialism, ethnicity, and imperialism, and, in particular, examining the ways in which these considerations intersect to construct and reproduce gender. So that's a long one, but basically what it means is that African feminisms often emphasize other concerns as directly impacting a woman's ability to make decisions for herself, right? Specifically, culture, colonialism, ethnicity, right? Colonialism is a big one here. As we were looking through all of those binaries, they overlap, right? They intersect with each other, they impact each other. So it's not just gender, it's race and gender, it's religion and gender, it's ethnicity, right? It's ruralness and gender, right? The way that my guru sort of performs her femininity is quite different from the way Tambu's mother performs hers, right? So all of these things, all these ideas interact to form gender, to perform sort of like how these women sort of view their own gender and the roles that they're prescribed within that. So that was a lot, but I want you to think about some of these things in our discussion post this week. As I mentioned, Nervous Conditions explores a lot of binaries, right? Binary is sort of one against the other, yes? Men, women, English, African, white, black, and urban, rural, to name a few. Choose one set of binaries you see explored in the text. They don't have to be one of these. You can come up with your own. And write a 250-word post focused on one or two scenes from the novel. How do you see these binaries being upheld, challenged, or exploded altogether? Who are the characters that challenge these binaries the most? Which characters uphold the binaries the most? Remember to bring in specific moments from the text and respond substantially to the ideas of at least two of your classmates. Okay, so that is all for today. I hope that made sense, and I will see you all soon. Bye.